guys, in this video I'm going to talk about choosing the best method for solving a quadratic equation. I've had an entire series of videos on different ways you can solve quadratic equations, and a really common question I get is, which method do I actually choose? So just as a reminder, pause and try the examples when prompted, and I do have free guided notes available. And if I could ask you for a favor, consider maybe liking this video or leaving me a comment or subscribing to my channel just to help support free math help on the internet. So before we get started, this is a little bit of a self-quiz. There are 4 ways to solve quadratic equations. Before you start this video, you should know those 4 ways, and if you don't know those 4 techniques, you might want to look in the comments and watch some of those videos before you go back to this video. So hit pause and just see if you can remember the 4 techniques. Hit play when you're ready. Okay, so the 4 techniques, they are factoring, the square root property, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. You should be already pretty familiar with what these mean. Otherwise, you're not going to really know which is the right one to choose anyways. So here's a really common exercise, or an exercise I like to do after I've taught somebody the 4 different ways you can solve quadratics. So what I have here are 4 different quadratic equations, and there actually is a best technique for each one of them. So what I want to say here is you can only use those 4 techniques at most once for any one of these. So if you've used factoring, you can't use factoring again. So the best way to kind of figure this out is to, 1, get all of the terms on the same side. So notice that I've kind of written most of these on they're all kind of crossed up. So I've got the 2 over here. You might want to move these over. Then once you've kind of gotten everything on one side, start to think, is there one that makes sense for factoring or one that might make sense for completing the square? So really think about what you know about those techniques, and it will probably emerge as to which one is best. So I want you to pause the video and sit with this for a minute and then hit play when you're ready. Okay, so like I said, for these, there actually is a best technique for each. So if I write most of these out with them set equal to 0, so I will have these situations. So this one I'm not going to rewrite because this one already actually has a clear best technique, so I'll come back to that in a second. And then this last one, so let me write this last one out. So this is 3x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Okay, so here are kind of my 4 equations. So this equation is already really set up for the square root property. So that's what we'd want to use here because it's already set up actually in the format that we'd need for the square root property. So that one's kind of a given. Now for the other ones, as you go through this, well, only one of these can actually be factored. This is the only one that can be factored, so you want to use factoring for that. Now we're left to which one would be best for completing the square versus which one would be best for the quadratic formula. Well, with completing the square, it works best if you have the leading coefficient as 1. So just in looking at these 2 leftover problems, this is the only one that has a leading coefficient of 1. So that's kind of leading you towards probably completing the square. But then look at what your b is. Your b equals 6. So this is also going to be easy to take half of, right? If I had to divide everything by 3 here, this would be equal to 1, and then trying to set this equal to my b, it's just going to be harder, right? So there actually is a natural choice for which techniques you want to use. So for this one, you want to use completing the square, and then for this one, you want to use the quadratic formula. Okay, so if you haven't tried to solve these yet, go ahead and hit play when you're ready, and I will walk you through the solutions. Okay, so like we said for this first one, so I want to rewrite this as x squared plus 6x minus 2 equals 0. So just looking at this for a moment, my b would be equal to 6, my half b would be equal to 3, therefore my half b squared is going to be equal to 9. And now that I'm using completing the square, so I actually do want to have my equation back in this form. You want to have your 2 x's together. So I will write this out, so x squared plus 6x, and then I want to actually add this number to each side. So I'm going to go ahead and add 9 here, and then on this other side, so now I've brought the 2 back over, but I also want to add the 9 here. Okay, so now I have to factor the left side. So this will factor as x plus 3 squared, and this will equal 11. And from here, I'll use the square root property. So I'll go ahead and I'll take the square root of each side. There's not going to be a whole lot I can do after this, so I'm going to get x plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 11, not 3, sorry. And then I'll just subtract off the 3, so I get x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 11. Okay, so that was the one that was best for completing the square. Now, for the next one, we said this was best for factoring, so I need to bring that 2x over like I showed earlier. And then I just have to factor this, right? So this will be x plus 3, x plus 1, all that equals 0. So now I just solve. This will be x equals negative 3 or x equals negative 1. There are my two solutions, nice and simple. So factoring is always the best technique to use if it's available to you. Now for C here, this one is just screaming for the square root property because it's basically already set up for it. So I start by taking the square root of each side. Remember, this side will be plus or minus. So now I get 2x plus 1 equals plus or minus, well, the square root of 49 is 7. So now I need to break this up into two pieces. I'm going to have 2x plus 1 equals 7, and I'm going to have 2x plus 1 equals negative 7. So now I just solve both parts for x. So here I'll go ahead and subtract off the 1, so I get 2x equals 6. I divide both sides by 2, and I get x equals 3. Then for this one, subtract off the 1, so I get 2x equals negative 8. Divide both sides by 2. I get x equals negative 4. And there are my two solutions in this case. Okay, now for this last one. So we said this is best for the quadratic formula. So first I'll rewrite this as 3x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. As a reminder, you can't actually select your a, b, and c unless you have everything on the same side for the quadratic formula. That's actually a requirement. So now my a is equal to 3, my b is equal to negative 3, and my c is equal to 2. So I can now plug this all into the quadratic formula. So let me set that up. Okay, so I've plugged everything into the quadratic formula. So you can just see here that you're going to have a negative and a negative. So this negative 3 will end up becoming positive just with how the quadratic formula works. So I get 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus, so let's see, 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 2 will be 24. And then all of that divided by 6. So now I get x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 15 divided by 6. And notice now there's actually not a whole lot else you can do with this one. Depending on the class that you're in, some classes will just say you can't go any farther with this. It's not a real number. Other classes will say that you can turn this into an imaginary number. If you're one of my students, we turn this into an imaginary number. So the farthest you can really go with this is 3 plus or minus I times the square root of 15, all of that divided by 6. And then if I wanted to break that up into two separate fractions, this would be 3 over 6 plus or minus the square root of 15 over 6 times I. And then just notice, so this 3 over 6, this totally simplifies to, I'll just erase this and write out what it simplifies to, 1/2. That would be as far as you could go with that. So that would kind of be your final solution. So that's kind of the idea behind this, but if you'd like to try that one more time, I have one more set of problems, same idea. Pause the video and think about which technique would make the most sense and hit play when you're ready, and I'll go through all the solutions with you. Okay. So for this first one, this one's just screaming for the square root property, right? So if I just take this, it's like already ready for it, really. So I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of each side. So now I get 3x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 24. So the square root of negative 24, I can simplify this a little bit farther. So this will be 3x minus 2 equals plus or minus 2i times the square root of 6. That's as much as that one will simplify. And now I can go ahead and just solve for this x. So I get 2 plus or minus 2i times the square root of 6, and then I can just divide everything by 3. So my final answer will be 2 over 3 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6 over 3 times I. And that's as far as you can go with that one. You can't simplify it any further. Now for this one, this would be best for the quadratic formula because it would be very unfortunate to try to complete the square on this, and this also won't factor. So you've really got to use the quadratic formula. So here, my a is equal to 2, my b is equal to 5, and my c is equal to -1. So if I just plug this straight into the quadratic formula, here's what it'll look like. So let me work this out now using the order of operations. And this is another scenario where you actually can't really simplify this any farther, so this would be really as good as this problem gets. Okay, so for this problem, what you're going to want to do first is bring the x over. So I want to rewrite this as x squared minus x minus 12 now equals 0. And this can totally factor, so this will be x minus 4 times x plus 3 equals 0. So then my solutions are just going to be x equals 4 or x equals -3. So that's all you've got to do for that one. And now for this last one, this one you're going to want to use completing the square. So this one's almost ready to go. I actually want to bring this 5 over to the other side just so I have my two x's isolated. So this becomes x squared minus 2x equals -5. And now let me complete the square. First I choose my b, which is -2. Then I can take half b, which is -1. And then I can find half b squared, which is +1. So now I need to add that 1, that +1, to each side. So I get this result. And now I can factor the left side. So this will be x minus 1 squared equals -4. And then I can use the square root property to finish this off. So then I get x minus 1 equals plus or minus 2i. And then I'll add 1 to each side. So my final answer is x equals 1 plus or minus 2i. Now, I realize I went through these examples at a pretty quick pace. The point of this video is that you kind of already understand all the techniques before you jump into it. If any of these had you scratching your head and making you feel like you really didn't understand, please check out some of the links to the other videos in the comments section where I break out everything in far more detail with far more examples to help you get caught up. So you've got lots of options if you weren't sure, and then you can always come back to this video later. So thanks for watching, guys. Like I said, there's lots of other videos you can check out. If there's anything that you want to see or if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.